Number 13. Chevrolet Vega. General Motors needed a subcompact by 1971. The development timeline was 30 months, roughly half the time American manufacturers typically allowed for a new platform. The result was a car that Motor Trend awarded its Car of the Year for 1971, and that 2 million Americans bought before the engineering problems became impossible to ignore. The sleeveless aluminum block, topped with a heavy iron cylinder head, expanded at different rates when overheated, destroying head gaskets, warping cylinder bores, and consuming oil at rates that weekly dipstick checks became insufficient to track. Body rust arrived on the same schedule as the engine trouble. By 1973, period reviewers were documenting body panel corrosion in language typically reserved for vehicles exposed to seawater. Sales fell from early peaks to 78,402 in 1977, the Vega's final year, a trajectory that captured what the recalls and warranty extensions had not been able to fix. The Vega is at number 13 because it was the car that opened this list the same way it opened millions of warranty claim files, with a promising headline and a troubling second paragraph. 2 million Americans drove one across its 7-year run, making its failure one of the most widely shared automotive disappointments in American history. Almost none of them would do it again, and GM's reputation for building small cars took years to recover. Number 12. Ford Pinto. 400,000 Americans bought a Ford Pinto in 1974. To understand that number, you need the context. It was the same year the Arab oil embargo had driven gasoline prices so high that the subcompact went from a niche product to the only rational answer to a financial emergency. The Pinto was there. It was small, it was cheap, and it was in every Ford showroom in the country at exactly the moment when small and cheap were the only arguments that mattered. Behind the showroom, Ford held a document that would not become public until the Grimshaw versus Ford Motor Company litigation, an internal cost-benefit analysis that calculated the $11 cost of a fuel tank modification against the projected litigation cost of the injuries that the existing design would produce. Ford's accountants chose the litigation option. Before that document entered the public record, 400,000 Americans drove a Pinto home in a single year and parked it where the full-size car used to sit. The Pinto is at number 12 because its sales record is inseparable from its court record, and because the gap between those two numbers is the most precisely documented case of what it cost to be an American car buyer in the 1970s. The Grimshaw litigation made the internal documents public. The documents made every subsequent automotive product liability case easier to file, and the 400,000 buyers of 1974 became the most frequently cited consumers in American legal history. Number 11. Volkswagen Beetle. Every American car in 1970 had a water-cooled engine mounted in the front. The Volkswagen Beetle had an air-cooled engine mounted in the rear, a roofline unchanged since the 1940s, and a fuel tank positioned ahead of the dashboard rather than behind it. A design philosophy so different from every American product on the market that its continued popularity through the early 1970s required an explanation that marketing had nothing to do with. The explanation was that the car worked. Its owners drove it past the point at which American cars of comparable price and age would have required decisions about whether to repair or replace. The oil crisis of 1973 confirmed its fuel economy advantage over the domestic competition. The heater boxes that served the American Midwest with inadequate warmth in January did not register as a significant enough complaint to move buyers who had other reasons to stay loyal. The Vega is at number 11 because the 1970s inherited it as the most well-established import in American automotive history, a car whose reputation was already 20 years deep before the decade started, and no import that followed has approached the same level of recognizability without significantly larger marketing resources behind it.
Number 10. Chevrolet Monte Carlo. The Chevrolet Monte Carlo was the coupe that American buyers chose when they wanted something that looked more expensive than a Malibu without paying as much as a Buick. And in the 1970s, that specific market position attracted buyers in numbers that the Monte Carlo's production figures confirm without qualification. Its long hood communicated the presence of performance whether or not the engine beneath it delivered what the proportions suggested. Its Landau roof option signaled a level of style aspiration that the buyer who chose it was communicating to the neighbor who watched the car pull into the driveway. The optional swivel bucket seats, which rotated outward to assist entry and exit, were the decade's most specific automotive novelty, a feature that no Monte Carlo owner forgot having and that no passenger who experienced them forgot either. The doors were heavy enough that their hinges eventually sagged, a predictable consequence of their mass that the buyers who loved the car's proportions accepted as the cost of the visual statement. The Monte Carlo is at number 10 because it occupied the personal luxury coupe position through an entire decade and sold to every buyer who had decided that a two-door Chevrolet was the right statement for that moment in their life. And in the 1970s, that buyer was one of the most common profiles at any Chevrolet dealership in the country. Number 9. Toyota Corolla. In 1970, the Toyota Corolla entered the American market without an advertising campaign that could compete with Detroit's scale. What it had instead was an early owner base that was, without intending to be, the most effective sales force any automaker has ever deployed. The Corolla owner who put 80,000 miles on a car bought in 1972 and drove it to work every morning of 1977 was not a testimonial. He was a fact that his neighbor had been observing for 5 years and eventually acted on. The oil crisis accelerated the Corolla's American presence, but it did not create it. The reliability reputation had been building since the late 1960s and was already documented in the comparison tests that American automotive publications were running against domestic compacts with increasing regularity. The fenders dissolved in Midwest winters faster than the owners had been prepared for, contributing the orange dust that became a specific memory of Japanese car ownership in the Salt Belt states. The Corolla is at number 9 because its 1970s American growth was organic, documented, and driven by product performance rather than promotion, the specific combination that changes markets permanently. By the time the decade ended, the Corolla had established the reliability standard that American manufacturers would spend the following 20 years attempting to match with varying degrees of success. Number 8. Ford Maverick. The Maverick's $1,995 launch price in 1970 was a deliberate psychological threshold, the first American car priced below $2,000 since the early 1960s, positioned to reclaim the buyer who was walking into Volkswagen dealerships rather than Ford's. The decision to price below that threshold was as important as the car that carried it, because the number itself became the advertising. First-year sales approached the pace of the original 1964 Mustang launch. Ford had made a car whose sticker price was the entire argument. The 1973 oil crisis extended the Maverick's commercial life rather than interrupting it. Buyers who had been driving full-size American cars found themselves at the Ford dealer and discovered a compact with 3 years of documented reliability behind it, an advantage over the newest subcompact that had no ownership record yet. Total North American production across the Maverick's run reached 2.1 million units. The Maverick is at number 8 because 2.1 million is a number built one practical decision at a time, the car that the working family chose in 1970 and that the gas crisis family chose in 1974 for completely different reasons that produced the same sales figure. No other domestic compact of the decade served such two distinct buyer profiles with equal commercial success, while the underlying product changed as little as the Maverick did across its run.
Number 7. Honda Civic.
In 1975, Honda announced that the Civic CVCC had met California's strict emission standards without a catalytic converter, a technical achievement that American manufacturers had been insisting was physically impossible without unacceptable performance penalties. Ford, GM, and Chrysler had lobbied aggressively against the Clean Air Act's timetable on exactly these grounds. The Civic made those arguments obsolete in a single model year announcement. The oil crisis had already positioned the Civic as one of the most fuel-efficient cars in the American market before the CVCC achievement reinforced the case. Honda's dealership network in 1972 was modest compared to domestic manufacturers, but the buyers who found their way to it discovered a car that weighed approximately 1,500 pounds and returned fuel economy figures that the full-size American cars of the same year could not approach. The Civic is at number 7 because it arrived at the exact intersection of the energy crisis and the emissions crisis and addressed both simultaneously, in a car that buyers who chose it in 1974 tended to keep running well past the point at which they had expected to replace it. The CVCC achievement in 1975 was not a marketing claim, it was a federally verified technical result that made 3 American manufacturers' congressional testimony look not just incorrect, but deliberately so. Number 6. Chevrolet Malibu. The Chevrolet Malibu solved the specific problem that the American family of the 1970s encountered most frequently. The Nova was slightly too small and the Impala was slightly too much. The Malibu occupied the middle distance between those two anchors, more room than a compact without the full-size fuel penalty, available as a sedan, a coupe, and a station wagon, and priced at a point that made the trade-up from the Nova feel like genuine progress rather than financial overreach. In 1978, General Motors downsized the Malibu as part of the fuel crisis response that reshaped the entire GM lineup. The new Malibu was lighter and more fuel-efficient, but it arrived with an engineering decision that rear seat passengers documented in every ownership review that followed. The rear side windows were fixed in place and could not be lowered. GM cited weight savings. Every adult who ever rode in the back seat of a late 1970s Malibu on a warm day without air conditioning has a different explanation for the decision. The Malibu is at number 6 because its decade-long presence in American driveways across every body style and 2 distinct generations confirms it as the mid-size Chevrolet that more families chose in more years of the decade than any other configuration General Motors offered at that price point. Number 5. Ford Granada. When Ford ran the advertisements comparing the Granada to a Mercedes-Benz, American historians were divided on whether to call it audacious or misleading. What was not divisive was the response. 548,784 Americans bought a Granada in 1976, placing it among the best-selling passenger cars in the country that year. Ford had identified the specific gap in the American market that the mid-1970s had created. The buyer who wanted European styling, references at a price that a domestic compact buyer could reach. The car beneath the European-influenced body was built on the Maverick and Monarch platform, a fact that period road tests noted with the particular restraint of reviewers who had decided that documenting the truth was sufficient without editorializing about what the marketing had implied. For the buyer who needed a car that looked more expensive than it cost and came with Ford's dealer network behind it, the Granada was the correct answer in 1976. The Granada is at number 5 because 500,000 Americans chose it in a single year, and because the specific promise of European prestige at American compact prices was the most effective single pitch Ford made in the entire decade. The 1976 sales figure of 548,784 units placed the Granada in the same conversation as the decade's most dominant cars, achieved by a vehicle that cost considerably less than anything it was being compared to in its own advertising.
Number 4. Chevrolet Nova. The Chevrolet Nova sold between 250,000 and 350,000 units annually through most of the 1970s without generating a single story worth telling. There was no television show, no lawsuit, no cultural moment, no April Fool's Day launch, no memorable advertisement. There was the Nova in the factory parking lot on Monday morning, the Nova in the apartment complex lot, the Nova in the school pickup line. present in American parking areas across every region of the country in numbers that made it statistically certain that any American who drove in the 1970s worked next to someone who owned one. Its front subframe unibody construction and its inline-6 and small block V8 options gave it a mechanical durability that the decade's independent mechanics maintained without difficulty. The Nova's specific achievement was invisibility, the complete absence of a distinctive identity that allowed it to occupy the role of the decade's most common compact without requiring any buyer to justify the choice. The Nova is at number 4 because 250,000 to 350,000 units per year across a full decade accumulates into the kind of presence that parking lot photographs from the 1970s confirm. Everywhere, unremarkable, essential. The car that the working American family chose when they wanted a Chevrolet and needed it to do one thing: start every morning, without requiring any further conversation about it. Number 3. Chevrolet CK Pickup. The Chevrolet CK Pickup entered the 1970s as a tool, a vehicle American contractors, farmers, and tradespeople bought to perform specific work, and left it as something the American buyer was deciding was considerably more than that. Through the decades, sales climbed as the buyer who needed a truck for work discovered that the buyer who simply preferred a truck for everything else was arriving at the same dealership for different reasons. The third-generation CK, the square body that has since become one of the most recognizable truck designs in American history, arrived with clean proportions, a cab that served the job site and the grocery store parking lot equally, and a lineup of inline-6s and V8s that ran for hundreds of thousands of miles on the kind of maintenance schedule that working owners could realistically manage. The dual-saddle gas tanks mounted outside the frame rails gave it real-world range without requiring fuel stops that interrupted the workday, at the cost of a controversy about their positioning that regulators eventually addressed. The CK is at number 3 because the 1970s were the specific decade when the American pickup truck's transition from work tool to primary vehicle began, and because the truck that led that transition and held the gains every year after was this one. Number 2. Oldsmobile Cutlass. In 1975, the best-selling car in America was not built by Chevrolet, and it was not built by Ford. It was built by Oldsmobile. The Cutlass, in coupe, sedan, and station wagon configurations, outsold every other nameplate in the American market that year and repeated the performance in 1976. Total Cutlass production across the decade reached 4.2 million units, a figure that reflects not fleet contracts or rental company volume, but individual American families making the same mid-size Oldsmobile decision at dealerships across the country. The Cutlass occupied the position that the 1970s American middle class required with precision, above the Nova in perceived quality, below the Buick in price, available in a coupe body that communicated the quiet aspiration of a buyer who had arrived at the point where the Chevrolet felt slightly insufficient. It was the car in the driveway of the family that had done well enough, not the family showing off and not the family settling. The Cutlass is at number 2 because 4.2 million units across a single decade is not a fleet figure. It is a portrait of the American middle class at a specific moment in history, choosing the same car in every city and suburb of the country. Leading national car sales in 2 consecutive years during the worst economic period of the decade is not a coincidence. It is the record of a car that was exactly right for the buyer who had it.
Number 1. Chevrolet Impala and Caprice. The oil crisis of 1973 was supposed to end the full-size American car. In 1971, before the embargo, Chevrolet sold approximately 700,000 full-size cars. In 1977, 4 years after the oil crisis had supposedly rewritten American buying behavior permanently, the Chevrolet full-size line was back at the top of American car sales. In 1978 and 1979, it was there again. 6 of the decade's 10 years, the Impala and Caprice led the entire American market. The Caprice's premium interior and the Impala's accessible pricing gave Chevrolet the full-size argument at every price point. The buyer who wanted the best Chevrolet and the buyer who wanted a full-size Chevrolet without the premium were both served from the same platform. The 1975 catalytic converters, still primitive, produced sulfur exhaust on cold starts that made parking lots smell like rotten eggs every morning, a side effect owners accepted without enthusiasm. The Impala and Caprice are at number 1 because 6 of 10 years at the top of American car sales is the clearest possible answer to what the 1970s American family chose when they chose a car. Through an oil crisis, through stagflation, through every argument that the decade provided for choosing something smaller and more fuel efficient, the majority of American car buyers who were in the market for a new vehicle kept arriving at the Chevrolet full-size. They kept choosing this one.